Our interview this morning is with Jay Koval. Jay was born in Akron, Ohio, in June of 1936. He served active duty in the United States Air Force from July of 1955 through July of 1959. His highest rank attained was Airman Second Class. This interview is conducted at Burleson, Texas on Friday, July the 1st, 2011. My name is Dale Dexheimer. I'm not related to Jay in any way. Also in the room we have Gary Burton and Milton Gibson, who are our videographers. And with that little introduction, Jay, you can tell us your story about your time in the U.S. military.
All right, I'll be happy to. We're just kind of backing up a little bit, maybe 50-some years. Looking back, this was a time of the Cold War, because that's what they call it. They still had a draft. As I was not doing too well in college, I was looking forward to being drafted. I looked and took my chances. So I joined the Air Force in 1955 in July. Went through a training camp at Sampson Air Force Base, New York, which is no longer in existence. It's now a state park. And learned the many things we were supposed to learn about the military and how the military functions. But prior to that, backing up a little bit, when I went to university, I did belong to AFROTC and the Pershing Rifles drill team. So I had an advantage over some of the younger people who had never had any, what do we want to call it, any cooperation or contact with the military, except through their parents. After we finished basic training, it was a nice cool October, they decided to keep us up there because they were going to close the base. And they would ship us out one at a time or two at a time wherever we were going. I wound up in Dover, Delaware. Right down the world, just not too far, maybe 300-400 miles down the road, where I was trained as a fuel supply specialist. And I say this in jest because basically that's a gas pump jockey to a large airplane. That's it, Pegs. Matt's Air Boys, Dover, Delaware is Matt's military air transport at the time. And many things came through there, many an aircraft was serviced. And it came time to go overseas, and I got my orders. The orders read Thule, Greenland. That's a nice place. Believe me, it's cold. The day I got there it was minus 24. And the day I left it was minus 27 1 year later. But in between, you learn an awful lot. You get to be acquainted with the Army, who was stationed with us up there. You meet many fellows that you will never, never see again. You're kind of a different group. And my training with the supply and fuels leaves us to something different up there. Because it is so cold, vehicles don't start, things freeze up, people don't work as well, and believe me, you work slowly because you have to be just accurate. I spent a little bit of time there, approximately 1 year, or I think my records read 11 months and 24 days or something like that, and I was returned to the States. Unfortunately, I returned to the States for my father's funeral. After that, there was a time when I looked at my orders and said, I'm going there. And that was Homestead Air Base, Miami, Florida. In my opinion, that's from one extreme to the other. Believe me, you cannot adjust your body in 30 days to go. I was still doing the same thing at Homestead, except for the fact that Homestead didn't have room for my, what they call AFSC. They had too many of us down there, so they split most of us up into other places. And I thought I kind of came out on the top of the pile because they sent me to work at the Special Services. Special Services covers many things, from the movie house on the base to all sorts of odds and ends. My particular assignment was one of the Air Force Base pools. sort of a lifeguard type, keeping track of everybody that was there. I did that for approximately the last, I think it was 9 to 10 months of my enlistment. Consequently, when my time came up, I decided I'd bow out honorably. And they were kind enough to send me home. Actually, reserve time was, for me, after active duty, was simply a name in a filing cabinet, because that was called the Ready Reserve at that time. Although I was an 8-year obligate, the other 4 years were done, as we called it, in a filing cabinet. They just don't go back and put you automatically into the Air Force Reserve, because at that time the Air Force Reserve, I believe, was just forming. And there were a few places there. In my home state of Ohio, there was only one place, and that was Lockbourne at Columbus, Ohio, which I don't believe is in existence any longer. If there is anything at all, it's connected to Wright-Patterson, which is right down the road, right down the road another 100 miles, and so forth. I've spent the other time since then using the experiences that I've had in the Air Force to forward my civilian work, believe me, because I've met men there that I still admire to this day. I'm going to mention a little fellow, and I cannot remember his real name. He was in our organization. They called him Fat Baby. The gentleman's intelligence quotient would be limited, but he taught me to work physically, how to lift, how to punch, how to do what had to be done in the physical sense of work itself, and I admired the man at the time. Many of the others that I've met, well, in my time have passed on. I don't doubt it, because I don't know how many of us are left from my original organization. Really, this is about what my life in the Air Force was. It wasn't really a whole lot, because this was peacetime. Quote, that's what they said anyway. But we were all trained to look for and be aware of the surroundings, because at that time, as I mentioned earlier, that was called the Cold War. And there were things there that they asked us to look for. Right now, I kind of chuckle, because as an overseas person, we were not supposed to, quote, take pictures of the base we were on because it was classified. But believe it or not, most of us have pictures that did not get out at that particular time, and we're sitting on them now. Don't know what else I can tell you, Dale, from that standpoint.
Okay. Well, good. That's a good start for us. You were going to school, college, university, whatever.
Yes.
Where were you going, and what was your major, Jay?
Kent State University, which is rather infamous.
Yes. Interesting that you went from there to the Air Force.
Right. This is before time.
Right.
Before that time, but at Kent State itself, I was enrolled in the basics of the teaching profession.
Oh, okay. Okay. You went to basic training at Sampson
Correct.
Air Base in New York, up in the Finger Lakes area. How the military operates. What were some of the things? You were there for how many weeks, Jay?
That time, that would have been a 12-week training course, which takes you from the beginning, from when you walk in the door to when you walk out. You also have approximately I'm going to say, if my memory's right, 3 to 4 weeks of field training. Anything from weapons to equipment and so forth, which I don't know whether they do anymore or not. It's my understanding from one of my grandchildren who was in the Air Force that it is a 6-week particular basic training course, and then goes on to whatever field that they're going to look at.
Spend a little time on a grinder?
Yeah, marched a mile or two.
That was one of the things that you learned in military operations.
Yeah, that's quite true. But also I had some training, of course, having gone to the university, I belonged to ROTC and the what was known then as the Pershing Rifles drill teams, which gave me a somewhat advantage going into the Air Force on a regular basis.
Pershing Rifles,
Yeah.
something I hadn't heard about in quite some time, but nonetheless. Manual of arms, could you still get out there and take that M1 and do the manual of arms?
It's possible. It might take me a little bit of review, because I don't think there are too many of those floating around anymore.
Okay. Okay. Go on to a fuel supply specialist.
Right.
I'm just a little younger than you, but when I went to high school, almost all the boys worked at a service station one time or another.
Mm-hmm.
You ever work in a service station before you went to college, or
Well, while I was in college, I did, yes.
okay?
Mm-hmm. Worked
And-
evenings.
And the military found that you were suited for this kind of a job.
I don't know. Upon the closing of Sampson Air Base, I was there when it did shut down. I was originally set up to train as a TAC instructor, but we were moved at that time to other fields, and this one came up this way. I have a nickname for it. We called it a gas pump jockey to a B-47, and that's about what it was, because most of that, to train not from what we did at schools or in high school or college, you're operating tractor trailers loaded with large amounts of fuel and dispensing same, no matter where you are. Most of us, that one, we're also trained in the use and the handling of liquid oxygen, which is a very dangerous mix. And it's just something you don't want to mix with a quart of oil. You may be looking for somebody about that time.
So you did have there was some specialized technical training on getting to be a fuel supply specialist. You got some chemical training.
Yeah, it's an OJT situation, usually taught at that time by one of the staff sergeants or someone above that rank,
Okay.
but the NCOs.
You went to Dover Air Force Base, Dover, Delaware.
Correct.
Currently, I know one of the missions at Dover is to bring the guys back from Afghanistan and Iraq. Was there any such mission, the casualties?
If there was at that time, we were never notified as to what came and went on the base. Of course, we knew what was loaded on those aircraft, but we never knew what came in. The other thing is there was another section of the base too. We did have a fighter squadron of the old F-86Ds at that one particular time. So that was base protection, more or less, or the East Coast in a lot of cases. But aside from that, I really don't know. I'm going to presume some of the casualties may have come back through that.
You live in a barracks all this time?
Absolutely. The situation there, barracks-wise, if you go back to Sampson, New York, the barracks there was old military, Navy style from World War II. That's
Open bay?
open bay situation, 60 guys to a bay. It was a nice change when we went to Delaware, because there were 3 men to a room, and it was more like an apartment to a certain degree compared to the other one.
But even at Dover, you have weekly inspections?
And yes, I would say they did. Those of us who worked the midnight shift were not, didn't have to stand down for them, because most of us were coming in from work at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was marked night workers on our doors, and that's the way they left us. They'd stick their head in the door, but they wouldn't particularly say anything.
When you went to Thule, you had been at Sampson, then you had spent some time at Dover, so you'd had maybe a year in the Air Force?
Oh, let's see. I left Sampson in October, November '56. Went to Dover. Was there for approximately 9 months or so. Then gone to Thule for 11, 12 months.
Were you single all this time, Jay?
Absolutely. That's the only way to go through the military, as far as I'm concerned. Now it's a little different situation. I know because I've got one grandson in the Army and another grandson in the Air Force.
Your time at Dover, you're pretty low ranking.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you do with your weekends?
Weekends were spent, really had a lot of fun on time off because you're only maybe basically 100 miles, 150 miles from New York City. A lot of us would go into New York City on occasion or even go to Cape May, New Jersey. You had to go around Robin Hood's barn to get there, but you over on the ocean at Cape May, and it's very interesting and a lot of fun to been had. Been through Philadelphia many times, and occasionally if I could sneak a few days extra, I'd come back up home, say hello, and then come on back.
How'd you finance all these weekends? I mean, you were, what kind of money do you think you were drawing at the time? You probably don't remember exactly, but...
$96.38 a month.
Okay, you do remember.
That's not hard to do because it really, you know, as much as you look at it that way, that's cash in your pocket. Everything else is furnished. Your clothing is there, your meals are there if you care to eat them, and so forth and so on. Your medical supplies, whatever. So on $96 a month, you can kind of putter around and have a good time.
So you could go to Rehoboth Beach, or you could go to Cape May or up to Wildwood and have a pretty good weekend.
Spent many a time in Rehoboth Beach. It's just almost, you could almost walk there from Dover.
You go with a group of 3 or 4 other guys?
Usually. Most of the time it was your night shift people or the guys that live in the barracks with us. Whoever had the car. Most of us didn't. I did, but...
That's one of the things that people forget about the military, the car. And we've talked to a lot of guys who had cars, and there are a lot of car-related stories. So,
oh, yeah.
You went to Thule.
Yep.
Kind of an abrupt change. It was minus 24 the day you got there?
That's correct.
Okay. What sort of housing facilities did you have in Thule?
Thule was kind of an very interesting place from the standpoint that the buildings were what at that time were called a reverse refrigerator. They were aluminum sheeted buildings, section walls, I'm going to guess at about 4 to 6 inches thick. Each section of the barracks was divided by a rubber divider, and they were warm. They're steam heated from a main, they had a main facility that pumped heat throughout the base.
Boiler, probably, that generated steam.
Yeah. Boiler, generator type, who knows? But you could see the pipes as they ran above ground because you're sitting on permafrost. And when you're sitting above ground and the pipes come into the buildings, and as we joked, it was a reverse refrigerator because the cold was on the outside. But it would keep you warm. It's no problem. I can remember just seeing, I won't say it's the warmest place in the world, but when it's 20 degrees below zero outside and your room's 50, it's not bad. So.
You have the same sort of berthing arrangements that you had at Dover. You have 3 or 4 guys to a room?
In this case, it was 2.
2.
2 to a room, 6 by 9. It gets a little tight. Double bunk, whoever gets the top. 1 desk, some clothing space, not much. But these would not have been a standard size barracks, as any one of us has been in would know. Not that way. Mm-hmm.
Of course, you weren't too worried about a lot of clothing anyway. I mean, you had your military wear, and you weren't too worried about having civvies, because where were you going to go?
Not too far. Occasion. Yep.
In a situation like that, in the time that you were in, Jay, what activities did the Air Force have for you on base? You had a bowling alley, I suspect?
No bowling. No? You had of course, the PX or BX, whichever you want to call it, had to change names on us while we were up there. That was there. You had the movie theaters. You had some general woodwork shops and a few other things where you could do hobby supplies and odds and ends. But a lot of it's interesting from the standpoint of, have you ever met an Eskimo? And we did see a few, there are some, and to see what was up there. Those people are entirely different. I don't know how they spend all their lives up there because they don't know any different, but they just kind of hum along. You'd see them occasionally at the BX. They could shop there. Thule itself is a Danish possession, and a lot of people don't realize it, and Greenland is. And so at the base you had your, they call them, I think, the Danish liaison. They had one member of the Danish military that was there all the time. I remember seeing the individual, but that's all I know.
You were in a considerable number of years ago. The base had an EM club, an NCO club, and well, you had enlisted NCOs and officers clubs, I assume.
Thule is NCO and officers. I don't think there was an EM club up there.
Okay.
That I can remember anyway. Probably so.
In an area like that with the conditions you worked under, alcohol a problem for anybody?
Alcohol was technically not available.
Oh, it wasn't?
No. Because
Even in the clubs?
yes, in the clubs, and having not been in the clubs, I can't say. Because presumptively the officers EM NCO clubs probably. But other than that, I really don't know. Because you don't see much of it, and you don't want that condition if you're out wandering around in the snow. Not a real good idea, especially those of us who drove all the time. Because we delivered fuel as far out as 20 miles off base. And once you leave the base, there isn't anything left. It's just a bunch of snow.
Where would you take fuel, say 20 miles off the base?
Fuel off base went to what, I'm going to pronounce this, and I hope I can really remember it. It was called Betungawanas Mountain, or P Mountain is its nickname. There was a radar control center up there. You took fuel in every day. Somebody went up with a certain amount of fuel to keep their tanks and their heat and their equipment running.
Okay.
This, from the time you left the base, which is approximately at sea level, to the time you got to the top of the mountain, was 4,000 feet, and it rose in less than 20 miles.
Wow.
Which is a little bit of steep driving. And it's all ice.
You are still a fuel supply specialist?
Yes.
Those sort of atmospheric conditions, the adverse temperatures, and you were JP5, I suppose? JP4? 5? 4. Okay.
5 didn't exist at that time.
Did it gel? Did you have any problem with?
Not to my recollection. JP4, not too bad. It's high-grade kerosene, as far as we used to joke about it. But what you will find, and I won't mention how much of the storage is there, because I don't know how much of Thule's still there. But we knew for a fact that in our storage area, the regular gasoline in the big tanks, fuel tanks, the first 3 feet of those tanks was ice, because the water would separate, go to the bottom and freeze. You had pure fuel.
Wow.
Most of the time. And if you got into serious winter weather, where it's 35 below zero plus, do not shut your vehicles off, because oil will coagulate, and that's it, they won't start. At least the ones we had wouldn't start.
Let's see here. Fuel gelling. I guess that's about my extent on Thule. Special services, I'm sorry, where were you involved with special services? That was at Homestead.
Yep, that's in Florida.
Okay.
But that's a nice trip home from Thule to McGuire, New Jersey. That's 15 hours on a C-54.
How many?
15 hours with a stop at Goose Bay. And today they could probably do it in 3 hours or less. So.
One of the things I was going to ask, you were in the mid-50s, so you serviced both gas, reciprocating engines, and jet engines.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever get to fly on anything, Jay?
Yeah, we flew C-54s. I've flown in old Gooney birds, the old C-47s.
They were generally from one duty station to the next.
Oh, yeah, generally speaking.
As a member of a ground crew, you ever get to ride in, say, a B-47?
No, B-47 carried only 3 people, as I recall.
Okay.
I put a lot of fuel in those things from time to time.
Do you know anything about the missions that the B-47s flew? The ones at Thule? I guess you had them at Thule?
No, they'd come through, refuel at Thule and leave.
Okay.
Most things would refuel and leave. The only thing that was at Thule was permanent was the fighter squadron was at the, I'm thinking, I want to say, it was called a Scorpion. The
F-89s.
Yeah, the F-89 with all the pod rockets you could see from there. Yeah, the 89s were there. They were permanent. The rest of it would be somebody coming in for repair service or dropping off and leaving supplies, and they'd be in and out and gone. In some cases, I can't blame them.
When you went to Homestead, Homestead is south of Miami?
Yeah, it's in, well, it's Homestead, yeah, it's south of Miami, I think, by, I want to say 35, 40 miles, give or take. But Homestead itself, there is a town of Homestead also, so the base was connected. And I think Homestead no longer exists either.
You had a little more time. You probably had maybe another stripe. How much money were you making when you got to Homestead? You remembered the $96 and some odd cents,
Yeah,
so I thought you might.
Probably another $12 to $15 a month, give or take.
Okay, so you're making $110 a month.
Yeah, something like that.
Still living in a barracks.
Oh yeah.
Let me back up a second. When you went to Thule, I assume you left your car stateside, or you sold it, or
I left my car with my parents. Yeah, back in
Okay.
Ohio.
okay. So you come back to Homestead. You stop by the house and pick up the car?
No,
No.
I didn't. That had been sold in the process, and so I just went to attended my father's funeral. When I went to Florida, I took a 26-hour Greyhound bus ride from Akron, Ohio to Miami, Florida.
Fun ride.
Oh yes, and I don't know when it stopped because I was still asleep when I got there.
So here we are in Homestead, South Florida. $110 a month. You still live in the barracks. You still have the same 2, 3, 4 men in the room?
Usually, yeah, 2 to 3.
Okay. What'd you do with your spare time at Homestead?
Spare time at Homestead, you could, if you had any money, if you could pool your money and find a ride. Most of us would go into Miami itself. I spent a lot of time at the bowling alley, which was off base, called Cutler Ridge Lanes. I don't even know if they're still there. But most of them, that's where the air base team practiced at the same time. So I bowled with a few of the fellows that were on the team. Had the opportunity to see some of the pros, because in Miami at that time, the Professional Bowlers Association had what they call a traveling team. And those traveling teams would bowl in a different bowling alley every Friday night. So you got to see some of the old pros at that time.
What sort of high series would you have?
I've been in the 600 series
Okay.
myself at times. Couldn't do it now. Haven't picked up a bowling ball for 20 years. So, wouldn't know.
You completed your service, did your reserve time, and you did mention the fact that you have used your Air Force training, your Air Force experience as you went through civilian life in the last 50-plus years.
Oh, yes.
You expand on that just a little bit, Jay?
I can expand on it from the standpoint it teaches you to deal with people if it doesn't do anything else. Having left the Air Force and 59 active duty and puttered around, you might say, with a few occupations till I could find something solid. I was a police officer for about 10 years in Ohio.
You go back to school after you got out?
Negative. I have
Okay.
attended some call them schools if you want to, that dealt with law enforcement, et cetera, and so forth, but not really.
Ever used your GI Bill at all?
No, I've never used it.
Okay.
And they tell me I still could if I wanted to, if I dug around long enough, but I don't really know. I've never had the really feeling that I should.
You mentioned one person, and I think a lot of your military experiences are the things you remember are the guys you served with.
Yes.
Or these days, the boys and girls you served with.
True.
But Fat Baby was he was an NCO, I guess?
No, the gentleman was an enlisted man. He was an Airman second, the same as myself. And I wish I could remember his name, because I can tell you this. He was from East Orange, Texas, and that's all I can remember. But a man who can teach you to work with your hands, I thought was worth quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Especially because he was good at it. Teaching somebody to lift and carry and do what has to be done is rather hard to do. But if you'd watch him and listen to him, he could teach you most anything you wanted to know along that line.
You remember any non-coms or officers, particularly good, particularly bad, any that made some sort of lasting impression?
There are a few that I can remember. I don't think I'll go into names. Some of them are probably still living. I had the occasion to, I might say, trip over one of the pilots at a base who I'd been in ROTC with. And he had the chip on his shoulder, in my estimation. Once he found out who I was and where I did looked and found out who I was, he says, oh, things changed immediately. But so many of those people, pilots, they're good people, most of them. Most of them are half nuts.
You have family members, grandchildren,
Yes.
who are in the active military today.
That's correct.
Reflecting on 50 plus years ago, overall, good experience?
For that, at the time I served, I'd say yes. At the time I served, it was not a violent situation going on most anywhere. It was just sort of what they call the Cold War, keep a lookout and be ready to go if you have to. But technically, we didn't have to. And that's one thing I think is a positive from that standpoint. Today, I don't know. Right now, one of my grandsons is in Iraq, and the other one is in Afghanistan. So I don't really want to comment one way or the other, except for the fact the one in the Air Force is a munitions specialist. I got my fingers crossed when it comes to that young man.
Okay. We thank you for coming down today, sir, and spending the time with us. We appreciate your time served for the country. Good interview.
We thank you.
You bet, Jay.
Anytime. Give us a holler.